It is easy as a minority group to assume that you have support the moment you see cheers, the moment you see parades. But it's important to understand that outside of these areas, many people are still suffering, many people are still vulnerable, and that is why we say prioritizing liberal areas shouldn't be the sole priority of this LGBTQ plus movement. The first thing I want to frame is, what is the context of South Korea? Two things here. Number one, we have seen gradual but centralized progress, mostly in Seoul. Number one, in terms of Seoul pride parades that are pretty big. Number two, media coverage of these parades and of the support. But thirdly, NGOs and queer support networks that probably only exist in Seoul, such as Between Friends. Number two, outside of Seoul, where we look at firstly the west part of South Korea, places like Incheon or Gwangju, which are closer to Seoul itself, are a lot more liberal. They are liberal, but they probably don't have great amounts of support. They're probably not allies of the LGBTQ plus movement, but they are progressive in nature. But secondly, other areas, rural and provincial areas that probably are a lot more rural and conservative in nature, are places that are probably against things like queerness because of the existence of things like family culture that believes people should have families and like give birth to babies and stuff like that when they grow up. But secondly, also toxic masculinity that exists in South Korea, which is a big problem. Secondly, then what is the problem with this instance? Number one is the over-centralization of advocacy, where too much funding going into these areas doesn't mean that support gets any much better. They have to prove why the ceiling has not already been hit in Seoul in terms of the support that you can get. Because if you just say you need to prioritize this area, means you're just feeding into the same kinds of facilities, the same kinds of support. So even if your pride parades get bigger and bigger, you need to explain the impact of them getting bigger and bigger and how they can trickle down effectively. But secondly, social isolation, where many individuals outside of Seoul not just feel envious, but feel in a more vulnerable state, feel a lot more oppressed in these areas. But thirdly, is just the lack of mass appeal, which prevents you from getting long-term change like legalization, which currently does not exist in South Korea. The first argument then is, why is it justified to significantly prioritize? Four parts to this argument. Number one, what is the incentives of the South Korea queer movement? Number one is the creation of support groups and safe spaces. This is very important because especially when you consider the context of vulnerability of queer individuals itself, this is not just an incentive that exists within South Korean queer movements. This is the incentive of all queer movements, where you want to create these safe spaces, where you want to make sure individuals have access to things like support, etc. Secondly is awareness, and this doesn't necessarily mean support and be an ally, but you have to think of it from the perspective of someone who's a conservative. How do you get your conservative friends to believe in your progressive values? I think all debaters have been in this particular instance, where we first get them to understand that these things exist, that these things, like people do hold these identities. So the starting point is not just complete support, it is just, I might not agree with your lifestyle, but I'm okay with you existing, I'm okay with you being a member of my community. But thirdly, it's just that long-term legal recognition that I was talking about. It is necessary that when you significantly prioritize these areas outside of South Korea, is where you're able to get that long-term change as a result of the massive appeal that this is able to garner. But secondly, this is just a lot more equitable. Many individuals outside of Seoul who are queer don't get to access any forms of support. Number one, because of the family culture I told you about, how people are kicked out of their houses in these rural areas and stuff like that when they are being queer. But secondly, it's things like toxic masculinity, things like national service and how male are supposed to be this masculine, strong person, means that a lot of these narratives are just a lot more propagated in the long term. But thirdly, the third part of this argument is on resilience. If we rely on one city only, this is vulnerable to things like suppression. Politics change, governments change, which means in the event that South Korea does turn conservative, a lot of the progress that you get in Seoul already is something that's going to be traded off, because it's just much easier to crack down on these communities because they're just in one area. I think when we decentralize then, we don't just guarantee people in rural areas get that support and awareness that we talk about, but we also guarantee people in Seoul themselves are protected. Therefore, I think we are just able to co-opt their biggest benefit as well in terms of protection of people in the capital city. The impact of this then is simple. Number one, I think we get to fulfill the intentions of why this queer movement exists in the first place, where we get to protect the most vulnerable. But two, we don't just protect people in these rural areas outside of Seoul, but we also make sure that Seoul gets to keep doing their pride parades, gets to keep pushing for support groups and more queer networks and stuff like that, and like something that they can't get on their side. If I move on, yeah.
If politicians change and things like Roe v. Wade can get overturned, then obviously when you leave Seoul, the amount of capital you have it reduces, which makes it easy to overturn the progress that you have made up until now.
Yes, but progress doesn't just exist in like political change. Right? We're not going to go into these areas and just start saying, go queer, go gays and stuff like that. That's not going to create that support. Of course, these queer movements are going to like strategize in terms of stuff. I'll talk about this in my second argument. But secondly then, on how we get more awareness outside of South Korea. Number one, especially in the West, I already told you, people are somewhat liberal. They just not used to the fact that people can have queer identities. I think that we just get to utilize this identity to create more support. But secondly, I think this can apply to rural areas as well. The second part of this argument then is how we get more awareness. Firstly, in terms of visibility, like I said, we won't just go into these areas and start pushing for the most radical forms of queer acceptance of queer identities. We can start with academic talks and forums, how creating safe spaces can just protect individuals who are most vulnerable in your communities, etc. I think we can coalesce with other instances of like homelessness and stuff like that that also queer people go through. But secondly is normalization. When we talk about these things more, people become more aware of these identities existing. We might not get allies, but we just get more people at that starting point of understanding that these identities can exist. But thirdly is coalescing with other minority groups like feminists, etc., where we can use the progress that they have probably already made in this area to kind of say, hey guys, we need that support now because probably women can already live a marginally better life, but it's when we combine our resources, when we consolidate support, is when we get to achieve that increased level of impact and support towards not just queer identities, but also like other minorities which we can benefit as the queer movement. The impact of this is simple. Number one, why is this awareness unique? Because they will claim that you get to trickle down. One, a lot of media is just restricted to Seoul. So even if they say you prioritize equal resources, because a lot of media is already in Seoul, the biggest pride parades are in Seoul, the biggest visibility is in Seoul, even if you prioritize the equal resources, people's perception doesn't see that equalization. You need to tell me how is it that minorities on the ground in terms of queer individuals get to see that prioritization. But secondly is the creation of echo chambers, where a lot of people outside Seoul feel like people in the capital are too westernized or too liberal. But it's when we spread out, we don't just prevent echo chambers in both of these areas that are too conservative or liberal, but it's when we can create unique identities of queerness that intersect with culture, intersectionality of culture, things like India with trans people, things like Thai queerness and the drag culture that probably exists, means that the ability of conservative individuals to accept this is higher because it intertwines and intersects with the culture. But lastly then, on just how we get more support. Firstly, in the short term, more interactions and solidarity between provincial queer organizations means that it's more interconnected. This is important as provinces now more are capable of helping each other instead of just relying on Seoul. But secondly, it's in the long term. Seoul is just a single province. It's not enough to get the mass appeal to push for legislative change on your side of the house. The best case on your side is trickle down. But this trickle down never happens if people on the ground don't want to support it because they just feel like they're not being prioritized. So proud to propose.
Thank you so much for that fine speech, Prime Minister. Now to open up the clash of opposition, as no leader of opposition. Here.
Let's start with characterizing what being a gay person in Seoul looks like. I want you to note that this is a country that has elected a majority right-wing government with 99% vote share for the last
like 3-4 election cycles, which means there's barely any liberal spaces in Seoul, even though if this country in and of itself is very, very like right-wing in and of itself. But more importantly, right, there are other ways this manifests, and there's a very clear explanation for this. Things like having insane beauty standards for women, things like having like the highest female infanticide rates, even worse than India, which is very, very shocking. But like things like having a like structured family, like a strong preference for having the family unit, and that being like that being sent down the generations. All of this just explain how conservative as a country South Korea is. So even in the most progressive spaces, it's not enough to like start being gay and things like that. So if you, it's quite easy to believe that this is the moment in and of itself is already not doing enough for people within Seoul. But then the important point of this characterization is that if it's not enough for people within Seoul, it is definitely not enough for people outside of Seoul as well, and we'll deal with that later. Let's characterize a set of people who are actually able to join the movement in our side of the world. I think there's a reason why, even when the country is so conservative, like more people can join on our side. And there are 4 reasons for this. First, I want you to note that Seoul is the economic and cultural and social capital of South Korea, which means there's going to be like more educated people in Seoul, which means when people go to universities, they're probably likely to be more progressive. So even when the family is saying you need to have a fixed family unit, even when like say like the religion, like which is Christianity, saying that you shouldn't be gay, these people are more likely and susceptible to at least like get some university degree and be open. But on their side, the people outside don't have any ability to access the universities. But secondly, I want to note, right, the companies that these people are working for most likely are Western companies, right, which means they have like Western values where they're open to like say doing things like this, like Deloitte has a pride flag and things like that. Which means when you work for these companies, you're more likely to be open to these ideas, but you're unlikely to be open to these ideas in their side. You're not on their side anyways. But thirdly, I think people in Seoul are more likely to be rich, which means financial independence is the prerequisite for any social activism. Which means only if you have money, you can even think about like social activism. If you don't have money, you're just going to go to your job. You don't want to skip going to work. You don't want to do all of these things. Lastly, I think the media airtime that Seoul gets is very, very high. So any event that you do in Seoul is just going to be much more important. Now let's talk about why the very nascent LGBTQ movement can only sustain in Seoul, so which is why we need to concentrate our resources in Seoul. I'm going to do this in 2 ways. First, I want you to note that only if you keep doing activism in Seoul, you will get constant source of funding for the movement, and if you fizzle out, you will not get funding. And the reason for this is, I want you to note that because the set of people that are opting into the movement here will stop opting into the moment you step outside. And the reason for this is people uniquely care about like proximate benefit they get from the movement themselves. The only reason people want to go and donate to LGBTQ movement is because they provide safe spaces, they make you feel safe. Yeah. I think so. If I was a rich person in Seoul, I'll only donate to the movement when I feel like I have a safe space, when the movement cares about me. And the movement does that when they're able to do multiple pride parades. So every month I'm able to go to the pride parade and feel like it's okay for me to be gay, it's okay for me to be like this. At the point in time when they don't prioritize this and they fizzle out, and the pride parade is happening in Busan, I don't really know why I should be contributing to the movement, because I'm not really feeling safe about the movement, because the movement is not doing enough for me. I think in their counterfactual, you never actually get the money from these people. But more importantly, right, I want you to note that their buy-in is going to be very, very low, because it's a very conservative country. Okay. And I'll explain why the buy-in is going to be very, very low. When there is a protest in Seoul, more people will actually join the protest, and the reason for this is these are rich people who can afford to not go to work and turn up for a protest. On their counterfactual, these are, like the people who are in the provinces are not people who can afford to not go to work, especially because it's a country with high income inequalities, where like it's one of the worst in the world, where like the rich people have the most amount of money and the poor people have to suffer every day for like their day-to-day lives, which means they're unlikely to go ahead and go to the protest in the first place, because like they just don't have the capacity to go to the protest even if they have the incentive, because it just makes more sense to just go to work on their side in the provinces. But secondly, I want to note, right, it is just much harder to crack down in Seoul, and the reason for this is when it's the son of a Samsung family person who's getting hit by the police when they're going to a pride parade, there is going to be a lot more action on the government, because this is the rich person who's getting hit on our side. But on their side, when it's in the province, whoever gets hit, nobody cares, because it's very easy to crack down on the movement in the provinces. It is much harder to do it in Seoul, because these are rich people that can create action on our side. But lastly, I want to note, the media airtime is just a lot more effective in Seoul, because if anything happens in Seoul, it's national news. If you go and protest in front of the Supreme Court building, it's national news. If you go and do something in rural parts of Busan, who the fuck cares? Which means as long as As long as this is very, very effective in Seoul, and that you are unlikely to crack down, you need to make sure that the movement focuses a lot of its energy here. I'll explain the impacts of that, and if legislative change is what they want to win on, I'll tell you why that happens on our side. Yes.
Sharun, I assume you're an ally. You're telling me if you stop seeing big pride parades, you will just turn to homophobia?
So here's the deal. The problem is, if I'm a rich person, I care about my proximate needs. If the movement goes from 12 pride parades to 1 pride parade, I don't really know why I should contribute as much. So at least on our side, when it's a lot and I feel like they're catering to my need, I contribute more money, and when there's more money, you know what you can do? You can push for legislative action and things like that. But lastly, I think people will only contribute to the movement when they feel like there can be actual change and real change. I've already shown why the propensity of creating actual change is much more when you're concentrated in Seoul. I think then, when there is a chance of this happening, more people are likely to contribute more money. But on their side, when it fizzles out, you are not able to get the people to show that, you know what, you can actually create changes. So if there is more strength, more money, and more buy-in on our side, that is how you create legislative change. Why is that the case? Because the way you create legislative change is you go and protest and you make it a national news and you say, you know what, we want same-sex marriage, and that's how laws are being passed on our side. Like, people in Busan or provinces are not the ones who have political capital to make change. People in Seoul, the rich ones, especially in a country like South Korea, where the rich people have the most power in electing the government, the rich people have most power in lobbying the government to do the things, are the ones who can potentially go ahead and make this change. I think then, the trickle down that they're talking about on how we make these people's lives better is when you change the law for same-sex marriage, that affects everyone equally, not just people in Seoul, but even the people who are outside in the provinces. Which is why, when you are able to create this legislative change, and they concede that the legislative change has not happened, you are able to create it for everyone, and that is when you go to the provinces, not right now, when you have not created any legislative change. Only when you've created a large-scale action, when same-sex marriage is not bad, then you can go to the provinces, not right now.
Thank you so much for that. Your opposition. Now calling on the Deputy Prime Minister to extend the case of government. Here.
I have two broad issues in this debate. First, why this play of moving outside just perfectly aligned to the interests and obligations of the LGBT movement in South Korea, and I'll tell you why finally it's a matter of urgency for LGBT movement right now, waiting on an additional weighting metric that they don't argue for. First, why is this play perfectly aligned with the interests and obligations of the LGBT movement? I have three parts to this, and these are all three sections that already come out of speech. I see little to no response from the side of the opposition. First, principally why this must happen for the LGBT movement within South Korea. And it's a whole chunk of us argumentation that completely gets ignored and dismissed by this opposition team. He tells you multiple things of why this is principally on obligation for these things. Let me weigh them. First, in terms of equitability, why this must happen for a vast majority of other regions outside, because of historic long-standing provisions for South Korean LGBT individuals, which means there's been a lot of precedented resources poured into them, which means just because a deprioritization happens now, all of these structures don't mysteriously just vanish. They still stay there. Just the interconnectedness of intersectionality, the kind of clubs that you set up that are queer friendly, all these things just don't immediately fizzle out at the point in which you deprioritize. So, which is equitability, you must go to areas which don't have a lot of this funding, and it's a principal obligation for the LGBT movement in order to move there. But secondly, in terms of resilience, the long-term needs of this movement must be catered out to. They argue that Seoul is easily going to be flipped at the point at which you leave. While we give you multiple analysis why this is not true, I think for the LGBT movement, the long-term nature of the resilience must be done, which is the movement must spread its roots and its ideologies and its protections, increasing its members and protection of those members outside. So in the weird event that this thing does happen, we have other areas and other networks to rely upon when there's a long-term push for these movements to occur. We don't think this will be as big as Seoul or as powerful as Seoul, but these are grassroots movements that can exist in order to protect the very basis of LGBT movements outside of Seoul, in order to provide for safe spaces, provide for levels of representation, provide for levels of accessibility that play outright. These are instances that must happen on a principled nature. Secondly, about strategically, and this thing just lies about politics. Yes, so it's elected multiple right-wing parties in the past, but the right-wing party messed up currently, and now there's a liberal party involved because the lack of martial law just happened, which means now is the best time strategically for the LGBT movement to expand outwards. Why is this the case? Because right now the Conservative Party is in disarray, trying to catch up from the backlash upon their martial law scandal, which means they lack the means to backlash upon these movements because their priorities and resources go into other things about repairing their image as a whole. This is why this is the best and most strategic time for the movement to move into these areas, because you don't get any other window. This means there must be a strategic allocation of resource across these regions, and this contests directly with them arguing that Seoul loses support and not enough. First, there's existing acceptance and representation because you already spent resources within this region. They have not made clear why the existence of this just means the disappearing of these resources. Sure, maybe I give them their best case and rich people just stop funding them a lot more. I don't know why this means your interconnectivity, your interculturalness, and your safe spaces and clubs within Seoul just vanish as a result of this. This is not something they have explained. Resources allocated here means that there are structures that exist, NGOs, other gay communities that already exist in Seoul. But secondly, Sharun's analysis on the rich in education actually helped us so much because this means Seoul is already forward-facing and already progressive in nature. The saying that individuals are educated means several things. First, rich, educated, gay individuals are able to perceive that this movement is something that is strategic for them. If there's a pride parade in Busan, the people that can move there and do pride parades are these rich, educated individuals in Seoul. Which secondly, the very nature, because they're educated, probably means that they aren't as tied to their region as other areas. Which means them seeing a pride parade in Busan will not be seen as an abandonment of Seoul, but an expansion of my community, an expansion of my identity, which is why more support is likely to go in. And second, and finally, this does not mean that Seoul is vastly abandoned. If there is a weird way where suddenly a local policy turns that tries to shut down all gay clubs in Seoul, I'm pretty sure the LGBT movement will still fight against this. I'm not sure why. This just means an utter abandonment of the Seoul structures. But even if that's not true, there are existing structures within Seoul that already provide for them. That means strategically, we have a good foothold in Seoul. It's an urgent and good time to move outwards, but our window is closing. They don't provide to get it better.
If the window is closing, this is the right time to file those PIS, take the court cases, and pass anti-discrimination laws of the Liberal Party is there. So you need to concentrate resources to hire more lawyers. That only happens on our side. On their side, to keep on protesting on the streets.
Sure, this is true. But this also doesn't count the nature of South Korean politics. But your own analysis, these rural areas are also conservative. Which means, while Seoul is very good and the party is very liberal, this means that other regions are unlikely to vote for vast legislative change, because that's how government works. If you have one very liberal region and a lot of every conservative region, that means politically those are represented in your parliament. These are unlikely to pass those laws, even if you do have liberal governments that are involved. Third, practically, and these are approximate impacts to individuals that we both agree are vulnerable in this debate. There are three things that Ahsan tells you. First, we create unique safe spaces for these individuals that don't exist on the comparative because they lack the resources and susceptible to manosphere identities of these other rural areas of conservative regions. Second, you get representation in far-flung areas that don't happen. When you can see pride parades on Seoul and TV, that's one thing, but experiencing them in Busan and Incheon is a whole separate identity, which is important for representation of these individuals in queer areas outside of the metropolitan areas. But third, intersectionality among the movement means that you move from different class. They cease to perceive that Seoul is an elitist society that only protects gay individuals, or the right for LGBT individuals only exist when you have money, which is more opt-in from LGBT individuals in rural areas on a whole. This doesn't exist on the comparative or is bad in nature, which means they oftentimes neglect the people that need them the most. The weighing is this on speculation. Even want to give them the bad case, there's a liberal government and there is ability to get legislative change. This is speculative at best. We are unclear as to how people will vote. We are unclear how electoral systems work. The ability to provide safe spaces for these individuals to get representation for them in outskirts is a certain benefit that you can credit in the round that only side government provides to you. Finally, why is this a matter of urgency for the LGBT movement? And the frame is that growing sentiment of young South Korean men that Ahsan proves to you about disillusionment, about manosphere, red pill, because of male loneliness and incel narratives. What are these two implications that are very prominent in the rural areas? First, this means left without a countervailing nature that only the LGBT movement can provide, a lot of these sentiments become far worse on the opposition side when you only concentrate on Seoul. But secondly, for both closeted and non-closeted queer individuals in rural areas, this means the abandonment of other rural areas except Seoul results in them feeling more threatened and more isolated than ever. When every single internet login or any single conversation with their friends, they have to hide their very identity because they fear the levels of acceptance that don't exist in the rural areas. That's why it's important for individuals outside of Seoul to get these things. Why does prioritization countermand this sentiment? And I'll weigh where I go. First, primarily for those part of the movement, accessibility to the narratives and safe spaces that we provide So accessibility to the narrative and safe spaces that we provide are unique on our side of the house that doesn't exist in status quo. First, the scale of people that it reaches of queer individuals outside Seoul is something that's incredibly important because the accessibility and representation is very minimal on their side of the house, and it's important for these individuals to be able to access and represent their identity on scale. But secondly, the urgency for this protection of people, especially when there's a vast amount of conservative sentiment on the rural areas, even if it's not in politics, means that it's urgent for them to be able to access these kinds of safe spaces and access these kinds of narratives insofar as it's important for them to access their identities.
Thank you so much for that fine speech, Deputy Prime Minister. Now to extend the cash proposition, calling on Deputy Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Firstly, on that idea of progress is set in stone and it cannot be undone. The first thing to explain here is that when the overwhelming forces of patriarchy exist, it is in their incentive to find ways to keep curbing down on liberal influences. This is politically true because that is the way that you're able to find a boogeyman and convince more people to join your side outside of, because of fear mongering. That is why political parties find every instance possible in order to go ahead and lament liberal agendas or ideas. This is what happens when, this is what is happening in the US with Trump and the environmental movement. That is why they're constantly de-escalated, but that is why they constantly lose capital, because these politicians have it in their incentives to keep reinforcing what their narrative was. The second thing is, in the vast majority of instances, because of these strong countercultures, there are Christian evangelical groups. There are these anti-gay movements. In India, there are people who are the protection, protectors of religion. We call it the Vishwa Hindu Parishad and things like that. In those instances, they create nuisance. They go to these parades and shut them up. This is what we say, right? That it is far harder to do this it will be far harder to do this in Seoul when they see that the number in which people have turned up is thousands and thousands and not a few hundreds, because the capital that was used to organize was massive. What does this massiveness mean? Instead of you just kicking things off 90 days before, you kick things off 1 year before. There are more people involved in the planning. You make it more grand. You put in more funding in terms of the events. Maybe you call in someone to perform and things like that. For an anti-gay group to make that stop is far, far more difficult than an anti-gay group to go in Busan, round people up and tell them, what the fuck are you doing? This is not something that even happens in Seoul, the most progressive pockets of your country. Have you lost your mind? In those instances, we think that it is incredibly easy to undo the kind of progress that they have got. But even if it is not undone, what is the most reasonable impact? We think people are now not as empowered, they are scared. If you know that the queer advocacy groups who would go to the courts as soon as these people were rounded up or detained and get you out in 24 or 48 hours are not there, you will feel significantly more threatened in showing up for these people, because you think that the immediate cost that is attached to this is far, far worse. It is the veil of protection that someone is taking away from me which makes people feel extremely scared and keep put at home, which is the extreme problem that happens on their side of the house. But the obvious response is, sure, we have Incheon, we have Busan, why can't we go ahead and have mini parades here, and why isn't that enough to sustain the firing, the fire that burns in the movement? First of all, by their own messaging, by their own constructors, right? The media is concentrated in Seoul. That means the media in other parts of the country is vastly unorganized, so the kind of reporting is not uniform. That means that all of this capital is not consolidated, but rather fragmented in its messaging. So you're not able to catch the same kind of unified messaging. Because in Busan, you might have had a small demonstration against the police because they rounded up a gay man and shot him. But in ancient, you might have had a protest in front of an elite landlord because that person was not paying equal wages to gay people or whatever it is. We think this kind of fragmentation is far harder to consolidate and far harder, like it's far less instrumental in keeping the fire alive because of how it divides messaging on their side of the house. So in those instances, it's just quite difficult. What is the implication of this? Firstly, activist fatigue. We think people only opt in into your movement as insofar as they think the trade-off they are making is worth it. I am sacrificing the economic facet of my life. I'm sacrificing the other social facet of my life by being too pro-LGBTQ, and maybe like the ones in the middle, I am making them uncomfortable and things like that. This happens with all of us. In those instances, you need to see some ROI on the investment that you're doing. Otherwise, you'll be like, this was a fucking waste of time. Why did I put in so much money? Why did I skip that group dinner where everyone was there and repeatedly tried to show up to parades? Why did I act so secretive when people confronted me because I wanted to protect this part of my identity? Because protecting this part of my identity did not give me the return that I wanted. I would rather focus on something else. This activist fatigue happens with all of us because of how busy our lives are. And this is what happens on their side of the house. When they don't see a strong and constant source of motivation, they're far more likely to opt out. They're less likely to attend events. They're less likely to go ahead and fund events to the same degree on their side of the house. This is incredibly bad because in the vast majority of instances, losing core supporters who were there with you is far more important to prioritize than getting a new armchair activist, because the armchair activists need a lot of time to warm up to your idea. So there is a their impact only manifests after a long period of time because you need to have a long gestation period between awareness and between something happening. So the first thing is you prioritize people who are the core supporters and for whom this activist ROI matters more rather than these newbie people that they find in these places. The second thing that I just want to explain is how trickle down happens. We think that trickle down happens quite intuitively for two reasons. First, we think in the vast majority of instances, you can emulate what is happening in the city centers. That is what you can create awareness around. People are aware of these ideas. They intuitively know. They are somewhat read. The problem is they need a support structure or they need a role model to emulate of how to do this en masse and how to keep this up repeatedly. They say, rather provide this role model by going to their homes. Sure, but we think it is easy, like it is as easily achievable on our side. Why? Because even if you do Pride Parade on their side, it has to be extremely restricted. You cannot have the NYC Pride Parade in a rural part of Delhi that I come from, because the kind of things that are allowed, the kind of laws that are applicable are insanely different. The assumption that they make is that you transfer this Pride Parade in Seoul and put that in Busan. In Busan, you are probably wearing like full clothes and you don't have sexual empowerment. In Busan, probably the curfew timings are fucking 7 p.m. and then you have to go home. That means the kind of things that they want are incredibly small on scale in terms of change, but on our side, they are equally achievable by other means.
Is the ROI better when people get to escape direct homophobia and access NGOs and support networks? Or is it better when you get bigger pride parades?
So that's the thing, right? You think you can go ahead and set up a sexual shelter, abuse shelter on your side of the house. But the problem is, things happen one step at a time. You have to start with awareness because that is what is right now allowed in that space of society. You think you will go in all guns blazing and do everything that you want. That is not how things work because of how I explained that different areas have different laws, different kinds of acceptance or whatnot. So at best you have very small amounts of change. You don't get the shelter that you want. You get maybe a support group, people holding hands. That can anyways happen with the trickle down that we propose on our side of the house. The last thing that I just then want to explain is what happens on the comparative when you do not sustain this movement in Seoul. We think the kind of backlash that you receive is now far, far worse because people are able to say that the tyrannical age that we all lived in is now undone and it's now time to restrict their movement into the crevices and corners of South Korea as well, because when the stronghold falls, we think other areas follow. But on the last thing of where is it easier to get long-term change, we just think that it's the most opportune time for you to enter when the Liberal Party is there, because the higher the change, the more difficult it is to downscale. When you get political impacts, it is harder to overturn them than it is to overturn social impacts. So in those instances, we think make more change on our side, keep it more long-term for all those reasons.
Thank you so much for that final speech. Deputy of Opposition, no summary in case of government whip. Here.
I'm just confirming, am I audible here? Because my throat is a bit. The first thing I'll talk about is on opt-out, and the second thing I'll talk about is on visibility. The first is on opt-out. This most proximate benefit analysis applies literally to any and everyone within the country. The unique notion of the LGBTQ movement is that it's grounded in solidarity and shared experiences irrespective of your provinces. You are likely going to be more empathetic. You share experiences with other people beyond your provinces, and that is what makes you unique as a person that's participating in the movement. But the second thing here, they do care about the suffering of their brothers and sisters elsewhere. Even if you feel as though you are benefiting from these things, if you see your brothers and sisters in Daegu, in Incheon, in Guangzhou being having suffered under the police, engaging in things like hate crimes, for example, you still feel a sense of shame. You still feel a sense of guilt and a failure to be able to combat against these things. But secondly, I don't get at what point do they branch out on their comparative. Because this is such a soul-centric narrative, and people would never ever branch out. And then it's unclear as to whether or not this will actually happen on their comparative or whether or not it will trickle down. Because this means that a lot of the benefits may be applied in Seoul, but everywhere else where they agree that you have religious elements, conservative elements, it is now significantly harder for you to penetrate those provinces in the near future. The second is, would they opt out? There's no. The reason is no for a couple of reasons. The first is that you have NGOs, liberal political organizations, and queer think tanks in Seoul that are able to fill in that gap. Because Seoul is significantly more intersectional relative to any other organization within the provinces, whereby that intersectionality is not really seen. The second is that if these people are open-minded because they work in Western companies, it is unclear why do you need funding concentrated there as opposed to anywhere else where you don't have the same kind of open-minded people, where these people are significantly more vulnerable relative to the people in Seoul who are already open-minded. So it's unclear as to why you need the funding there relative to anywhere else. But thirdly, the movement has already done a lot within Seoul with regards to social acceptance and safe spaces. This is an expansion of the community outward and an increase of political capital elsewhere. So this argument assumes that when you do this, people in Seoul will feel like there's some harm being done there. But there are active infrastructures that are already built within these areas. There are active social support groups, and there is a high level of social acceptance in Seoul already. So it's unclear as to why when you pull out those fundings, those things suddenly go away. But second, and the last reason is that a lot of people in the LGBTQ movement have higher levels of empathy. Activists are not investors. They don't expect ROI from this thing. Meaning that a lot of them are still willing to support them at the end of the day because they still view them with the same level of respect and the same level of solidarity with people outside of those provinces as well. Meaning that a lot of their argument about opt-out just doesn't work in this regard. Because even if these are rich people, they're also rich people in other provinces that you're also able to tap into as well. So even if you lose this amount of rich people, there are other people that are able to do those things as well. Meaning that a lot of the benefits on opt-out just doesn't apply specifically to the LGBT movement, who has a higher level of solidarity and interconnectivity between one another. The second is on visibility. The first is that if the analysis is true, that you have a lot of religious conservative elements within those areas, and it becomes significantly harder for you to penetrate those provinces in the future. Because everyone else outside the provinces see the LGBTQ movement being only for the rich and those in Seoul. Absent of a countervailing narrative in those provinces, those religious elements become far more entrenched and far more normalized, and therefore it's a more dangerous environment for gay people living within those areas. Second, it's not just advocacy in terms of Pride Parade. A lot of the arguments that Pride Parade will be small, guys, they have to work, so they cannot attend Pride Parades. Think about this logically. There's also things like social and financial support targeted internally as well. It's the setting up of queer shelters where you are disowned by your family. It's the provision of numerous emotional support groups beyond not just one province, but multiple provinces in South Korea that requires the very high level of funding in those areas. Meaning that if you're able to have those things apply, obviously a lot of our benefits accrue to the most vulnerable of individuals within these areas. Secondly, it's not true that people in Seoul have a lot of free time. Seoul has the second highest suicide rate amongst office workers next to Tokyo. So if the argument is that people are busy, obviously people in Seoul are significantly busier if they want to make money, if these are rich individuals. But secondly, if this is true, then you just hold it on a holiday or after work. Like, what the fuck, guys? It's not just like this. If they're busy, they cannot have Pride Parade analysis. Obviously, you can still do these things. But lastly, on scale, Seoul has less likelihood to backslide because they are liberal and progressive bubble. Oftentimes in that area, it is on scale significantly harder for you to be able to backslide and trend back to discrimination of homophobia. All the benefits here only apply to people within Seoul. Yes, it is disunified right now, which is what Sai says. But when you have the consolidation of resources within those areas, it makes those provinces far more interconnected with one another. On their comparative, your hate crimes in Incheon, in Daegu, in Daejeon, in Gwangju, all go underreported and underrepresented. So on their comparative, these people not only feel left out, but these are the most vulnerable kinds of people. They are the most susceptible to things like hate crimes and being disowned from their families, from being kicked out of the house. The last one is that even if they have all these things, they have no capacity. They are aware, yes, but they and everyone else within these provinces still view it as a soul-centric agenda. They view it as an imposition of soul upon the rest of the community. So it's not just pride parades that we're talking about, it's everything else. So it won't trickle down, because even if people are aware that it's a soul-only thing. It's an exclusive thing only for the rich elite people within those areas. But the LGBTQ movement is not for that. It is for the general idea, for people, regardless of their financial status, regardless of wherever they are, to be able to identify and unite based on the fact that they are part of the LGBTQ movement. So on their comparative, they still are not engaged with our principle. The last one here, and this takes out the case, but before that.
Yeah, the moment you go to these places and start protesting or having these pride parades, you get more backlash, which means that people face more microaggressions from their families and more police brutality without any recourse. So the obligation is really flipped.
So we argue this in two fronts. The first one is that we argue that conservatives in these states are already in a state of disarray after the imposition of martial law already. So obviously a lot of the priorities are going back to recuperating the political imagery as opposed to engaging in things like hate crimes. But secondly, that backlash exists on their side as well. If that funding is not concentrated there, these communities are far more vulnerable, and if they are far more vulnerable, there are obviously a lot more right-wingers and other conservative elements are likely going to attack them as well. Meaning that if you don't afford them protection in those provinces, obviously there is now higher incentive for religious and right-wing elements to be able to attack them and to demonize them. The last one here is this is factually correct. That recently, Democratic Party leader Lee Jae-myung has just been elected. And as a result of that, it's a lot easier for you to be able to have less backlash within those areas because the federal government is still willing to protect you to some degree as well. So for all these reasons then, a lot of the advantage doesn't apply. Yes, maybe the pride parades in Busan, maybe the pride parades in Incheon are quite small, but at the very least, these are safe spaces for these communities to be able to express themselves and to protect themselves and to be able to identify themselves as truly gay or truly bi. All the analysis here doesn't stand in this debate because a lot of them just say it's small. But on their side, not only is the idea of legislative change very speculative, because Seoul is one region, you need multiple regions to be able to pass legislative action. But secondly, a lot of that is speculative. The most certain benefit that you get in this debate is the provision of safe spaces and emotional support within those areas.
Thank you so much for that, Government Whip. Now to summarize the case of opposition, calling on Opposition Whip. Here.
Ready? If the system of obligation that you follow creates more harm on the people that you're trying to find this obligation towards, you get the obligation in the negative way, and that's where this gov team loses the debate. The only reason they have to say that you will not get backlash is to say that there's a liberal party that doesn't want bad PR. But I want you to note their own reason that come that first week onwards. Media is concentrated in Seoul, so that means things like reporting in Incheon and Busan don't really happen. So even if police brutality happens in those areas, which we'll explain why it happens, you don't get that coverage. So the current government doesn't face the negative PR backlash, or the image doesn't get affected at all, which means they're okay, and that means local pockets, local politicians and local police are okay to go ahead and crack down on these people as soon as they have the pride parade, considering there is no coverage that goes away and becomes national when it comes from rural places. This is why the media is something that literally takes out their own idea of saying that, oh, imagery is the only reason why it won't happen. Secondly, I think in most cases, not the police brutality that really happens. In the worst case, even if you take that, okay, there's some PR and center there. It's your families. When they see you going out once a year to a pride parade wearing clothes that are all glittery and flashy, and they know that you're supporting, you're openly out of the closet, that is where they create microaggressions against you. That's where they kick you out of the house or beat you up and take you to a doctor, to a mental health specialist. That's when they go ahead and create more backlash. There is no media imagery for your family members going and doing this to you. What this means is that those backlash still happens. The problem is, as soon as you go ahead and get to these rural places, the kind of structures that are there, which are extremely conservative, they get fuel to say that you are coming, bringing vested ideas into our head. That's where you activate those anti-culture groups or anti-LGBT groups much more on their side of the house, when they go ahead and start backlashing against you, and they start cornering you on the streets, or shutting down your bars, or going ahead and burning with whatever structure that you have built, or going ahead and I don't know, just literally fighting with you and starting an anti-LGBTQ parade, or going ahead and putting on the social media that you should not subscribe to this mental disease. All those kind of narratives gets emboldened when you literally give them fuel. So in our side, what's going to happen in the worst case is that these people will just not come out of the closet. At least they get protected from microaggressions. That is better, because on their side, you literally enable and force the people to come out, to go and support this movement. Because if they don't come out, who's coming to your pride parade? Literally no one. So in our side, in the worst case, people just go ahead and hide their identities, probably never assert it, but we are okay with that trade-off. Because you know why? We are winning on the idea of political change completely on Seoul. And this is where I want to get to the idea of funding will still remain in Seoul, because you have already established a large culture there. But the problem is, and this is the biggest issue, that you pause the kind of LGBTQ progress that you have done. In the absolute best case on their side, you're not able to go ahead and push it up, which means the overturn window in the political change that you're able to get never really happens, because the funding gets cut off immediately. We explained this to two speeches where the funding will not increase, and they concede to this, that at least the funding already stays consistent, but it doesn't increase on scale, so that you don't tip the politicians over the edge to pass those bills. And this is where we uniquely explain that you get increased amount of political funding on our side of the house. It's very easy, right? That once this team is already established, you start going and filing those PILs in court. You start going ahead and protesting on and hiring those good top lawyers who can fight against you, or fight against the kind of anti-discrimination laws that are not present or decriminalizing homosexuality. This is exactly what happened in India. When the top Supreme Court went ahead and changed it, because media PR image for the current government matters more in the capital city, because obviously they care about liberal values by their own characterization. If that is true, then they're likely to go ahead and listen to you much more when you protest in Seoul and it gets covered nationally across, right? Because now they have an image pressure to go ahead and change this or agree with you. So if you get some amount of political change, even if you get decriminalized homosexuality, at least what you do is on our side, you co-opt all the benefits that they say, because now the police brutality goes away completely. Why do people in the entire rural areas also want to subscribe to what the state does at the center? It's very simple, because everyone, irrespective of what place they come from, rural or urban, subscribe to the state and the government, right? So if the government brings about some change or decriminalizes homosexuality, or they say Supreme Court strikes down a particular like a discrimination law, for example, a personal anti-discrimination law, everyone subscribes to it, considering everyone who goes ahead and places that kind of premium on why government structures are valid in the first place. But secondly, people on our side will then, even in rural places, feel safer to come out, because now they see that the top government has changed and everyone wants to emulate Seoul. This is where I want to explain why trickle down happens through multiple reasons. One, like I explained, news media coverage goes national. That only happens on our side of the house. Seoul is seen as the cool actor to emulate the cool city that everyone wants to become, and that only happens when you go ahead and bring about this change. On their side, you stop the steam in Seoul, which means it's impossible to go ahead and get those kind of overturn window shifts that really go ahead and bring about large-scale legislative changes. You emulate the kind of toolkits that happen, and also things like university spaces. This is what happens, right? We explained to you that the progress gets altered, but it also goes and becomes negative, so you start overturning the progress. Why? Because politicians in now Seoul can get the rhetoric or the benefit of not getting the kind of backlash, because Seoul has fizzled out its movement to other parts. So they can say that people in university space should not go ahead and have or host gay lectures or have those kind of workshops, because now there's no one to protect or continue that particular stream. So it's easy for you as a politician to justify why you should push against these people, push the right-wing conservative narrative. That's when you undo the kind of progress that the movement has also made in Seoul, and that's just bad. So companies don't have the incentives to hire more diversity individuals, considering the amount of PR is lost within the Seoul of itself. That only happens on our side of the house. It creates a larger scale of benefit, because people who are even traveling to Seoul, say from Incheon or Busan, can get hired to those companies, consider DI practices stay consistent. Because if you lose the kind of progress, the companies have no more incentive, because the PR literally gets washed away. So they'll hire literally anyone without the scare of backlash. This is what we uniquely at our side of the house, even for people who come in from rural areas. I'll take you. Sure.
This isn't a liberal dictatorship where the president can say gay, not crime. It is. Seoul has one seat in the Senate over the 20 other plus states. How do you pass laws on your comparative? The state is not a dictatorship. You can't just vote and then suddenly you decriminalize gay
Yes, okay. Maybe passing laws on our side is uncertain,
Yeah.
but it's also uncertain on their side by how many number of people really opt in when you start a pride parade in Busan, because people don't have the ability to assert their identity without getting kicked out of their families. That's also super uncertain. They never explain why Christian structures or people who are anti-LGBTQ will not crack down on you. That's also super uncertain. I think the biggest assumption on their case is that everyone really just opts in to some degree. But the problem is that opt-in is what creates more harm on these individuals. That's why they never opt in. At least on our side, consider this team that is already present, you can continue this without the fear of backlash, without the fear, because Seoul is also progressive and literally what they said. So you can at least go ahead and ensure that the movement sustains itself into the future, and that's where you get the trickle down. I'll explain what trickle down happens. I mean, the laws can get passed in their absolute best case, but even if they don't get passed, the messaging spreads because of the PR concentration. That is great because at least people can emulate Seoul on our side of the house. The movement is better on our side because of simple two reasons. One, we get increased sustenance for the movement. Sustenance means people stay in much longer because they see a constant sense of you filing PILs, so the constant degree of feedback that you get. So you get more funding because of that. You get people go ahead and keep on staying in this movement because they don't have to incur a huge opportunity cost now, or they feel the opportunity cost is justified to stay within the movement. That funding was from those allies only happens on our side. On that side, it gets lost because there's no incentive for these people to have fund this anymore. For all those reasons. Opposition.
Thank you so much for that fine speech, opposition with. Now deal with their bias education. Opposition reply. Here.
Ready? Let's start. Let's start with funding. I wanted to know, if the movement is about solidarity, they say that they probably spend the money because they feel empathy. I have a simple intuition for this. I feel a lot of empathy for Palestine, but I want, how many people in this room have genuinely voted for the Palestinian cause? You can feel empathy, but that doesn't mean it translates into funding, and that's why that mechanism is very, very weak. I want you to note the mechanism we say is much stronger because when you show that there's a proximate benefit that you get, that is when people spend a lot of money. Because even in our absolute worst case, that means the scale of people, maybe there are some unempathetic people who want proximate benefits, and those are the people who will spend more money on our side. That's how you get more funding. That is superficial at best. Do not buy the response. But secondly, I want to note, Raymond's response to time is also superficial. Because I wanted to know, people with time are it's not just a movement about protest, right? People with time are the lawyers who can take up pro bono cases because the lawyers in Seoul are probably rich. They can take up pro bono cases and they can sufficiently do that because they don't have to put food on the table because they're very, very rich. I think these are the people who can go ahead and fight against the courts, who can go ahead and change laws, who can go ahead and change these things. Which means when we say time, this has a big impact in what you can do for the movement. And that's what we explained in the first two speeches. But lastly, in terms of buy-in, I think it is not just okay for me to put all my time, put all my effort, put all my emotion and not get anything in return for it. Which is why most people, at least on scale, there might be some people who probably agree to whatever they're saying, but there are more people who probably want to see some sort of change that is happening, and the change is probably much more likely to happen on our side. What exactly is then the change that happens on both the sides, and let's discuss this properly. Because at best, the change that they say that can happen on their side is, oh, there's going to be more protests and suddenly people will feel safer. I think this is bad because this doesn't work because we mitigate it in multiple ways. One, so Seoul is what people aspire to be. If there's a pride protest in Seoul, presumably people will also feel the same kind of acceptance when they see the protest in Seoul and they concede that the media airtime is probably going to be given to Seoul and things like that. But secondly, and more importantly, right, if the scale of the protests are probably much smaller, if the scale of the protests can be broken down and the extent of how much liberation you can feel in the protest is probably higher on Seoul, that is when people will feel more accepted on our side. But then lastly, their only impact is awareness, and we say that awareness is symmetric because their mechanism of awareness comes through media and things like that, and that happens on our side also. So then let's talk about political change and why political change can happen on our side. Because the response is something you should not buy. The response is, Seoul only has 1 seat in the Senate. I don't think political change can happen on their side as well, because they're not going to have an overwhelming amount of people who vote. Political change happens when people fight cases, when they're able to change the fucking law. that is when you're able to apply the law that is probably able to apply to a lot of people. Even if that's not the case, they're able to change the laws, local laws in Seoul, which means it allows people to wear like whatever dress they want. It allows people to it allows like police to not prosecute and things like that. This is what they don't understand. This is what they misunderstand. And I think about political change as something that you get from voting. We never said that. From the first speech, we said political change, a change of the law comes from on our side. And how are you able to do this political change? And that's where my first speech gets activated heavily. Because when you have more money, when you have more time, when you have more buy-in, and when you have more pressure on the government, that is when you're able to do this. This is the nail in the coffin. If they agree that Seoul won't backslide, and I want you to note, for their case to work, they need to first accept that Seoul won't backslide. If Seoul won't backslide, this is the best time, if the liberal government exists, to go ahead and pursue these cases, because conservative governments usually put conservative judges on the Supreme Court and things like that. At a point in time when these judges are not present, and that is when we're able to actually get the change, because when the conservative judges don't exist, this is when you collectivize together and you make the change, and that change is long term. Now let's talk last about this principle, because the principle is the movement has to focus on people that they're not focused on. This is not true. The principle that the movement operates on is they need to help these people, and this help is much better achieved on our side, because we are not putting them in places where they're getting struck down. We're not putting them in places where they're getting like backlash, but rather we are changing the laws. We are setting the stone for changing the laws that actually helps them in the long term, and that long term is more important for the movement, because impact of that is the impact that the actor cares about, not a short term like protest.
Thank you so much for that opposition reply. Now, finally, here's the Vice Education to end this debate. I call on Government reply. Here.
A lot of what they're contesting, rich people funding, pro bono lawyers, are things that we are significantly prioritizing on our side. And that is why we move the resources that exist in Seoul to these rural areas that currently lack the support. The only response they had on their side is, rich people and your lawyers will pull out because pride parades are no longer on work days and it becomes too inconvenient. If these lawyers were willing to do pro bono work already for gay people in Seoul to fight these cases, I don't even know what these cases are, why is it that when we move to rural areas where people are more vulnerable, where people are suffering even more, suddenly they will say, oh, this is too fucking inconvenient. That is the problem of the opposition side, because they pick and choose what the incentives of these individuals are and simply give simplistic analysis on why is it that people will pull out. The first clash that I have in my speech is which side protects the most vulnerable. Judge, you have to care about this clash, because that is the main incentive of why queer movements were set up in the first place, because people are actively suffering. The first thing they talk about on their side is people in Seoul. People in Seoul will lose their support. The first response that we had to this is like the resilience of the movement in Seoul is reliant on you not just counting on your support in Seoul, but spreading it out into different areas. Therefore, in the event context happens as what they say, which is that there's a conservative government now, which was a lie already in the first place. But in the event that this just changed to a conservative government, what legs do your movement in Seoul have to stand on anymore? Because then there's greater crackdowns. Your pride parades just get completely shut down. There is no more leverage on your side. But the second thing here is that money is important only at the starting point, where you need those pride parades, where you need that inception. But it gets to a point where you're able to shift cultures, you're able to normalize, people accept you. It's unclear what then the margin of this money does on their side of the house. But the second area here is on the second part of this clash is on rural areas. The language of opposition implies that they're just giving up in these rural areas. Number one, a lot of people were conservative at some point. People in Seoul were conservative at some point, but we fought against this conservativeness in order to change that. It is unclear why suddenly we can't do this anymore in the point at which we switch this to a rural area. But secondly, backlash. On your side, when you equally prioritize, is when movements in these rural areas are more susceptible to that backlash, because they don't have that backbone that supports that. But it's when we significantly prioritize, is when we are able to resist much harder against backlash, is when we get get to create more like resistant safe spaces, and we get to do this well. But what did we tell you on government then in terms of awareness? We told you why people don't just become allies. This accusation coming from opposition that we're just going in guns blazing doesn't make sense. I told you why these movements are likely going to do this strategically. They claim that there are laws there that will prevent this from happening. What laws prevent conversations from happening? If you can create awareness, you can create normalization, you can talk to people in terms of why this is necessary. I don't get why we can't do that. The way here is, even if we lose in terms of big pride parades or even slightly less safe spaces, that's fine, because cultures have already shifted in Seoul. What you need to prioritize now is these vulnerable areas where there's no support. Therefore, we win even on the metric of ROI, because people get to escape active harm and homophobia, versus on their side, which is just bigger pride parades. But let's talk about the meat then on legislative change. I want to note, the first thing I want to say is on opposition, they say you lose the support of rich people, which prevents you lobbying for change. It's unclear why all these people wanted to see a big pride parades as number one. Presumably these people are allies, probably still wanted to feed into these things. But the opposition then said these rich people only care about their jobs. If they only care about their jobs, why did they even fund these parades in the first place in Seoul? But the second thing here is, even if we lose the support of rich people for tangible events, we get to still maintain that support, that normalization and that awareness. But secondly, in terms of the media, I think Raymond already told you why media coverage can also be covered when you're in a rural area, because you're able to shift cultures to a big extent. There's a big change that media would want to cover. The impact of this is that a lot of their support is reliant on rich people continuously funding, when rich people don't even want to continuously fund on their side, because their incentives can change really quickly, right? What do we tell you then on opposition? Number one, you lose the support of rich people from lobbying. What do we tell you then on government? Number one, how we get long-term change. This is not the US where it's somewhat liberal. You need to push for that broad change. You need to push for that broad support, because all these other states are conservative. But number two, in the off chance that you do get liberal change, they don't get how they're able to change the minds of these people in these conservative areas. Therefore, very charitably, we don't know if people will opt in on our side, Judge. We don't know if you're able to get that broad change, but what we are able to guarantee you is that awareness, the building of safe spaces which prevent and mitigate the most active proximate harms that gay people are currently facing in this context. That's why we win.
Thank you so much for that speech, Opposition.